The Property Pod. Welcome to The Property Pod with Moneyweb. The property sector is an ever-changing sector. And in this podcast series, your host, Suren Naidu, chats to movers and shakers in the property industry.
Welcome to The Property Pod, South Africa's leading property investor podcast, right here on Moneyweb, also as a vodcast on our YouTube channel, dubbed Moneyweb TV. JSE listed sectional title developer Balwin Properties made a big announcement last week, a proposal to take the group private, and that's with the backing of the Public Investment Corporation, or PIC. It's an interesting move and comes after Balwin released its results recently or earlier this month. Now, we're not talking to the group's founder, Stephen Brooks. We've had him on the podcast a couple of times before, and hopefully we'll have him soon. We have someone who's covered the stock for several years, and he's a well-known small caps market commentator and analyst, someone who I have been trying to get on the pod for a number of years. Anthony Clark, welcome to the Property Pod. And Anthony's from Small Talk Daily Research.
Yeah, hello, Suren. It's very good to be here. Excuse my casual demeanor, but I tend to work in a very sort of laid-back affair from my home office here in Romans Bay. So if you hear a barking in the background, it's my dog running around. But otherwise, yes, it's been a very interesting few days in the property sector with Balwin being delisted.
How long have you covered the stock? Was it from the listing? And what do you make of the announcement? Good or bad move?
Yeah, I probably picked up a company, I'm probably guessing about 5 years ago, in the small to mid-cap space, as I'm sure you are aware, and as many of your listeners would be aware. There are very few analysts who actually have the ability to actually cover the sector. And I think over the years, as the large brokers have basically walked away from covering the JSE small to mid-cap market, there's been gaps in the service and availability of information. And I have a very large institutional client base. I have had for the 30 years I've been analyzing small to mid-cap companies in the JSE. And some of my clients just basically said, listen, no one's covering this stock, perhaps you should. So that's when I picked it up. So I got to know Steve Brooks and the entire team. And I think anyone who's followed the company from its listing a good 10 years ago now have realized the company's share price has gone one way. And it's been a very cyclical play because, as we all know in the property sector, a property, unlike the general equity market, is completely directed by the underlying tonality of the economy, the direction of interest rates, and of course the feel-good factor of the consumer. And that has not been in the best area for residential property companies for the best part of a couple of years. So I think the delisting of Balwin, which has been announced at R4.35, is possibly the best way to go. I think certain companies in a cyclical sector where the demand for long-term capital perhaps does not sit very well with the short-term nature of stock market investors should actually take themselves behind the curtain and conduct their business behind the scenes. And that's exactly what Balwin is going to be doing.
Now, Stephen is a very flamboyant and entrepreneurial founder and CEO. He has a sizable stake in the company. It's pretty tightly held share anyway. What do you make of the PIC's move? It's interesting also considering that they also got involved in Waterfall City with the JSE-listed attack.
Yes, I think Steve Brooks is what I call a Marmite character. There are certain CEOs listed on the JSE that can be called Marmites. You either love them or you hate them, a bit like the yeasty condiment. And I've always liked Steve. You either like him because he's energetic, he's entrepreneurial, he's brash. He has a determination to actually grow and to do good for not just the company and the economy, but also his shareholders. And perhaps people don't like him because he's colourful and brash and loud and focused on growing. So I've always admired him because for an economy as difficult as this, for any entrepreneur to actually start and actually create a multi-billion rand listed entity, particularly in the property sector, takes a certain degree of what I would call tenacity and chutzpah. And he certainly has that. So when I actually heard that Balwin was being delisted by the JSE, again, it didn't surprise me. I think the share price, as I'm sure you and your listeners would know, hit a low about a year and a half ago of R1.80. You know, as we stand here right now, it's trading at about R4.20 with an offer at R4.35 to value the business at roughly, call it 2.2 billion rand. So I think it's come a long way in the last 12 to 18 months. I think the large discount to net asset value, I think the net asset value from memory is about 9 rand 77, might upset a few people. But as I said to some of my clients yesterday and on my own Twitter page, or should I say X these days, to keep Elon Musk happy, at the end of the day, a property company, as you know, you can't liquidate property assets quickly. It can take months, if not years, to get the right residential or permits to actually rezone, to then sell the land, etc., etc., etc. So the discounts to me might seem slightly unfair to some, but for those that dissent to say we want our pound of flesh, good luck trying to unwind that portfolio, sell off the assets, and actually monetize that in a timely fashion. Investors, as you know, in the JSE, generally take their money and run. I think there are very few parties who will dissent to this deal who may be prepared to wait years for a proper unwind of a company to unlock that net asset value. So as I said yesterday, take the money and run.
So what does that translate into if it was valued at its full value? And that's unlikely because it's a little bit like much bigger company, a little bit like Southern Sun, where myself and Oleg also mentioned last week that if you are to sell out, it's worth 40 billion. How much is Balwin really worth?
Well, that's the multi-million-dollar question, or the multi-million rand question. You know, they're a very large land bank, and that land bank even has to be rezoned to residential. But again, as you know, covering the property sector far closer than I, land zoning has a different value depending on its use. You know, agricultural land is a very low use because it's just used for growing crops. You then convert that agricultural land into, let's say, rezoning for warehouses or shopping centres or residential or golf courses or some form of high-end development. The escalation in value can be stratospheric. So as it stands right now, Balwin is basically valued as a residential plain sectional title. As you know, they have been selling off parcels of land for hotel companies, shopping centres, fuel stations, potentially schools, clinics, etc., etc. But some of their land is in very fast-growing nodes, particularly in Gauteng. So who will know what happens in the years to come if a certain part of Mooikloof or some of the other large developments that they actually have is carved out and a regional shopping centre goes in, perhaps linked to a hotel or some form of residential and leisure estate. So as it stands right now, I can't give you a definitive answer, but we do know that the reported net asset value is 9 rand 77. But it could be much higher than that. But again, as you know, it can take years to get planning permission to rezone a piece of land to optimal development stage.
I will get to a piece of land that they announced that they sold in the recent results, but are you pretty confident that this deal is going to go through and a delisting of the stock?
A part of me, Suren, is actually quite sad Balwin is being delisted. When I joined the JSE, I'm going back now 30 years, there were over 800 listed companies on the JSE. And I think as I stand right now, there are probably in round numbers about 270. You know, Balwin is being delisted and I have my fingers everywhere in this market. And there are probably another 2 or 3 that I'm well aware of that could be delisting in the next 12 months or so. So I'm always very sad when a small to mid-cap company who's given, 10 years of its life to the equity market suddenly decides to delist. But again, we have to be pragmatic. If the underlying market does not want to re-rate or value a company in a manner which the company feels is worth, then, why not delist it and take the money and build up a company in the private space to unlock the value either for, private investors or in this case, the PIC and the co-founders. So I'm actually sad it's being delisted, but I can't say I'm surprised because the stock, as I say, for a number of years since the IPO, the share price hit an all-time high of 11 rand. It hit a low of 1 rand 80. It's only rallied in the last 12 months on the cuts in the repo rate. I think we've had 3 cuts in the repo rate. And of course, latterly on perhaps tittle-tattle and whispers of a potential delisting. As I said on my X page yesterday, the day before, if this listing does fall apart, I can categorically assure your listeners that Balwin would not be trading at 4 rand 20. It would probably fall back to well under 2 rand 50. Because a certain amount of the valuation of a company is purely on the unlocked potential of a delisting. If you look at the underlying fundamentals right now, the property segment, particularly the residential property market with geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, an unlikelihood that interest rates in this country will fall any further. In fact, there is talk of an interest rate rise to counteract soaring inflation because of fuel and food price increases. Now, that does not bode well for listed property companies like Balwin or even Calgro M3. So, sadly, £435 may not be the best possible price, but in this environment, take the money and run.
Okay. Now, it's interesting you mentioned that. I'm not going to go into the fuel situation. There's likely to be an interest rate hike for May. We know that will impact the property sector and the residential sector. Now, you said there's potentially other delistings. When I asked you to comment on the Balwin PIC announcement, you speculated, as it were, that there could be, even the likes of a Calgro could look at a delisting. Can you share some insights on that, or am I being too provocative?
I think you're being a little bit too provocative. At the end of the day, a small to mid-cap analyst, particularly one like myself, and I'm not blowing smoke into the air here, you built up a certain relationship with the market, and you get to hear what I would call just general tittle-tattle and gossip. Does that tittle-tattle and gossip actually lead to some form of transaction? Often it does, most often it doesn't. But what it does do, an analyst like myself, who's been around for now the best part of 30 years, you start doing what I call mosaic theory, where you take tiny scraps of information and you file them away in your mind. And as things start to develop, you then start knitting those little threads together to make a piece of cloth. And then you cut that piece of cloth into a possible permutation. So for an example, with Balwin being delisted at £435 by the PIC, we had an off-screen discussion regarding Calgro M3. Their market valuation right now is 473 million rand. They're on a price-earnings ratio, as I looked right now, of under 3 times. Their net asset value is 16 Rand 47. They're trading right now at about 4 Rand 30. I would imagine I have no insight and no knowledge. If I was the CEO of a major shareholders of Calgro M3, looking at what the PIC and the founders of Balwin has done regarding the delisting, I would be thinking to myself, well, shouldn't we be doing the same? Getting long-term, low-cost funding from a parastatal long-term investor. And if the market does not want to value our share, potentially delist it. Looking at the Calgro M3 long-term chart, back in May 2016, this may stagger you and your listeners, the share price traded at a high of 22 Rand 50. It's now at 4 Rand 30, having come up a long way. Balwin's high also was in June 2016 at 11 Rand, showing you that a good decade ago, literally near a decade to the point of this podcast, the market and the environment in this economy was substantially different regarding consumer sentiment, economic buoyancy, and the interest rate and GDP outlook. 10 years later, we're in a very different space due to state capture, government inability, and the collapse in varying provincial metropoles and councils that we have seen across the country. It's only the Western Cape, and I'm not saying that because I live down here, but seems to have bucked the trend. Many other parts of the country, as we all know, is basically infighting amongst politicians or collapsing as we speak. That does not bode well for long-term investment in residential property companies in the listed space.
So Balwin and Calgro are creating these precincts. We'll chat to Calgro and get their comments on that. Anthony, thank you so much for your time. Before you go, I wanted to pique your interest. I'm not going to ask about the other small cap companies that you cover. I know food producers, for example. So this is the property pod. But this next question and final question is related to a schools or education stock, Advotech. Now, they are in a different space, but they own a lot of properties. And I've got elephant's memory like you. Around 2019, we chatted about Advotech and them looking north of Durban for a campus. And since then, they've made an announcement under Imerys about investing in that campus finally, but not in that area. Do you have some insights and comments on Advotech before you go? Also in Sandton, they recently invested in a campus.
Yes, well, in Sandton, they took the old FNB training centre in Grayston Drive. and they've basically converted that into a very large centralized education campus on the tertiary side, because part of Advotech's plan going forward is to consolidate, perhaps smaller, older buildings in varying locations into one mega campus where the underlying students can actually have a much greater environment in terms of a university type setup to actually, learn, live and work. In Durban, I've been well aware for a number of years that we're looking at a development called University Hill, near the Sabaya Casino. That option has lapsed, and they've now bought another piece of land towards, I think, Umhlanga, where they intend to develop, again, a very large campus to consolidate a number of separate buildings in downtown Durban into a brand new campus. Now, I understand that'll probably cost, several billion rand over a lifetime of the varying phases, which is a very interesting development for Durban, again, given the politics in that province. But it just indicates that education in this country, particularly in the tertiary space, students want to learn. If the state is unable to accommodate them for whatever reasons, there is an option available in the private sector. And if Advotech is prepared to put down what will be a multi-billion rand investment over a number of years, consolidating, Rosebank College, Vega, etc., into their new brand Emirates, under the auspices of eventually getting university status, they clearly see long-term demand in that province. So I would imagine that development will be an anchor to that region and actually potentially spur growth, because as you all know, when an education campus goes in, there needs to be shops, accommodation, and other form of leisure activities. So it could be a spur to that growth node as Advotech builds out that tertiary operation.
Interestingly enough, it's also on Old Tongaat unit land, and it's in a precinct called Konabia, which is not far from Gateway and Umhlanga, but not as further up the coast. Anthony, I know you need to rush off to a presentation, so thank you for your time on the podcast. That was Anthony Clark, the founder of Small Talk Daily.
Thanks for listening to the Moneyweb Property Pod with Suren Naidu. To listen to more episodes, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates. Follow Suren on Twitter @Suren Naidu for more of his property industry content and other business stories.